The West's sanctions were supposed to put a swift end to Russia's oil industry. With each economic measure passed, Russia's oil was meant to become harder to sell, in turn preventing Vladimir Putin from amassing the money he needed for his Ukraine war chest. But it didn't quite work out that way. Sanctions are in place, but Russia is still selling plenty of oil. That's about to change thanks to Ukraine. Russia grinds to a halt as Ukraine's flying sanctions are working better than the West's traditional ones ever did. So what are flying sanctions? Long-range drones. Dozens of them, which Ukraine has spent the last month launching at Russia's oil refineries to destroy production facilities and set oil products ablaze. These attacks, which have been a constant occurrence throughout August, but have also been a highlight of Ukraine's strategy since 2024, are designed to gradually weaken the Russian military by taking away Russia's fuel source. We mean that both literally and metaphorically. Refined oil is the literal fuel that Russia's soldiers need to keep their mechanized units running, of course. However, it's also a fuel in the sense that it's the most important product that Russia has that it's able to sell to other countries. And thanks to Ukraine's flying sanctions, Russia has less of that oil to sell than at any other time during the war. We take you to the Saratov region. Lying on the Volga River, Saratov is one of Russia's key industrial regions, and it's home to an oil refinery that is vital to both the Russian war effort and the provision of domestic fuel. This is an oblast that is among the richest in Russia in terms of its natural and industrial resources. It's also a place of culture and science, being home to 3 universities, 6 institutes operated by the Russian Academy of Sciences, 19 project institutes, and 21 research institutes. Saratov is also one of the targets that Ukraine has hit over and over in August. Unlike Russia, which would have happily targeted the universities and research institutes while claiming them to be military targets, Ukraine has focused all of its flying sanctions on a single location, the Kuibyshev oil refinery owned by Rosneft that operates just south of the key city of Samara. On August 31st, Ukraine capped off a month full of refinery strikes with one more hit on Kuibyshev, as its flying sanctions zeroed in on the cracking towers the refinery needs for oil distillation, along with some of the facility's oil reservoirs. Russia claimed the attack didn't succeed, the Kyiv Post report. Every single drone was shot down, with the refinery only suffering minor damage as a result of drone debris. That's a refrain so common that it's almost become a cliché when Ukraine unleashes its flying sanctions. The Ukrainian drones hit their targets. Russia says it's just debris. It would be enough to make you wonder just how powerful Ukraine's drones would be if they scored direct hits. Were any of it true? But Russia's claims are never true. Every time you hear the word debris, you can assume that it translates to Ukraine's drones hit their targets, and that was certainly the case at the Kuibyshev refinery. The Kyiv Post says that social media soon started telling the real story, with multiple explosions and a massive fire being recorded and shared by the people of Samara. More confirmation came from the European Pleiad satellite, which flew overhead and shot images days after the strike, showing a large fire and plenty of smoke damage on the refinery's main cracking tower. At least 2 of the refinery's oil reservoirs had also been struck and were set on fire as a result. As for Kuibyshev, it had been taken completely offline, just like several other refineries during August. Now, this may seem like yet another story about a Ukrainian drone strike against a Russian oil refinery, and it is. However, the real story here is not the strike itself, but the impact that it has had on everyday Russians. You see, Kuibyshev is a pretty important refinery. When it's fully operational, it's capable of processing 7 million tons of oil per year, which amounts to about 140,000 barrels per day, according to Pravda. The Kyiv Post adds that this is roughly equivalent to about 2.5% of the Russian Federation's total oil refining capacity. That's a far more substantial amount than the percentage makes it seem. And it's here where the real story comes into play. In neighboring Samara, which the Kyiv Post says is a relatively wealthy region that is home to about 3.3 million people, Ukraine's flying sanctions are starting to have a major impact. It's not the fires and the scent of burning oil in the air that are so concerning to Samara's people, it's the lack of fuel. Residents are reporting severe diesel fuel shortages, the outlet says, with pumps being empty of both the 92 and 95 octane gasoline at almost every fuel station across the region. That's by design, both by Russia and Ukraine. GP Vimpel is behind the shortages on the domestic front. The Russian fuel retail company GP Vimpel, a major gasoline and diesel distributor in the Saratov district and surrounding regions, in an announcement on Monday, warned its trucks could no longer deliver products to regional customers, hundreds of local wholesalers and gas stations, because of developments arising from unavoidable conditions, the Kyiv Post reports. Those unavoidable conditions are cracking towers and oil reservoirs going up in flames, which is where Ukraine's design comes into play. Ukraine's flying sanctions are forcing Russia's oil distributors, who have always enjoyed a plentiful supply of their valuable product, into making tough decisions. Do the refined oil products that aren't going up in flames go to Russia's military or its people? With Putin's invasion of Ukraine still raging, there can only be one answer to that question, and the average Russian is now going to start feeling the pinch. Just as Ukraine planned it. The situation in Samara is just a microcosm of what's happening all across Russia, as Ukraine's flying sanctions prove themselves effective time and again. Fuel shortages inside and outside of Russia are becoming everyday occurrences. The Economist highlights the reasons why in a September 3rd article, where it reveals that Ukraine's flying sanctions have now impacted up to 20% of Russia's oil refining capacity. It adds that about 40% of the long-range strikes Ukraine has conducted in 2025 have targeted refineries, and that the losses Russia has experienced as a result amount to over 1 million barrels of refined oil products, primarily gasoline and diesel, per day. The impact is being felt on the forecourts throughout Russia. The impact is being felt with the forecourts running dry and queues for petrol across different parts of the vast country. The wholesale price of petrol has risen by 54% compared to the beginning of the year and is at a record level, The Economist says, which highlights the supply and demand issue that Ukraine has created. For many, the supply isn't there anymore, and when it is, they're having to pay through the nose for a product that is constantly going up in price and shows no signs of slowing down. Even more worrying for Russia is the loss of revenue that's resulted from these refined oil shortages. The first 7 months of 2025 have seen Russia's state deficit run to $61.4 billion, The Economist points out. That deficit isn't getting any harder to counteract as Russia is running out of the product it normally sells to make back the millions it's spending in the war. This is the sort of problem that the West's sanctions were supposed to create. Ukraine's flying sanctions are making it happen. Still, all of these domestic shortages are needed, Russia will argue, because it has to keep the fuel flowing to the front. A little, or a lot, of discomfort at home is a small price to pay to ensure Russia's troops have what they need to maintain their offensives and defend the territory they currently occupy in Ukraine. Only those soldiers aren't getting refined oil products either. On September 1st, United 24 media reported that Ukraine's oil refinery strikes have become so severe that they're sparking fuel shortages in occupied territories, just as they are in many regions inside Russia. In the region of Luhansk, which Russia claims to control 99% of, reports are coming in of empty AI-92 and AI-95 fuel pumps. Queues numbering in the hundreds were reported in Luhansk and neighboring Donetsk, with the Kyiv Post pointing out that geolocated images prove that these queues were for fuel that is becoming less available. So-called Luhansk Ministry of Fuel and Energy cited supply disruptions, depleted reserves among fuel suppliers, and unusually high demand over the past weeks, United 24 says. Translation: Ukraine is destroying all of the refined oil that's supposed to be reaching Luhansk. Similar shortages are being felt in occupied Crimea and Zabakalsky Krai, United 24 says, both of which have been forced to create rationing programs that harken back to the days of the Soviet Union. The Kuril Islands are running on empty, as is Primorye. Shortages are also being reported in Russia's Khabarovsk region, which is about 3,700 miles to the east, along with several Russian districts that lie on the Pacific Ocean. Queues for sparse fuel supplies have also been seen in Vanino and Sovetskaya Gavan, both of which are port cities feeding into the Sea of Japan. All of this showcases how what is happening in Samara isn't a one-off due to a single refinery strike. It's part of a pattern. The latest in a series of shortages that are being created because Ukraine has taken matters into its own hands using its flying sanctions. What's happening here is a game of cause and effect on a grand scale. Ukraine is striking Russian oil refineries with long-range drones, forcing them to shut down and, in some cases, hitting the refined oil storage facilities at those refineries. Therein lies the cause. The effect is that Russia is dealing with rampant fuel shortages domestically and within the occupied territories, thanks to a strangulation of supply that it never thought it would need to worry about. The tactic is working. So much so that the European Union or EU's ambassador to Ukraine, Katerina Matanova, says that these strikes seem to be the only way to get any sort of response from Moscow right now. You have lines for petrol in Russia because the Ukrainians with their deep strikes were able to disrupt the oil deliveries, Matanova told Politico. So this kind of pressure works, and we just need to keep at it and not get sidetracked. It's a kind of pressure that isn't new to 2025, even if it seems so, given what Ukraine has achieved during August. According to Medusa, Ukraine carried out at least 81 strikes against Russian oil facilities in 2024, which amounts to about 6 or 7 every month. That's already an impressive number, and it shows that the concept of taking sanctioning into its own hands using long-range drones has been a popular one in Ukraine for quite a while. However, these 2024 refinery strikes, as well as those that took place during the first half of 2025, weren't enough to cause the sort of fuel shortages we're seeing right now. Why? Well, part of the answer comes down to volume. August 2025 has seen Ukraine hit more Russian refineries than it has in any other month. According to The Independent, the period between August 2nd and August 24th saw Ukraine hit Russia's oil infrastructure at least 12 times, and there were more strikes in August besides, such as the Samara attack we discussed earlier in the video. What we've seen in August is Ukraine likely more than doubling its average monthly strike rate compared to 2024's refinery attack frequency, telling us that it's hitting Russia more times than it ever has before. Reuters adds that Ukraine's strike had affected 10 of Russia's oil refineries as of August 25th, leading to an at the time 17% refining drop-off, though that figure now seems to be closer to 20% per The Economist's figure we shared earlier. More strikes mean more refineries being shut down and more Russian oil going up in flames. It's all very logical. However, there's more to it beyond Ukraine hitting Russia's refineries more often. Ukraine has also evolved its refinery striking strategy from 2024 in a way that Russia never expected. Before Ukraine would hit a refinery, then it would leave it be, focusing future attacks on other targets. But in August, and this will likely be the case for the rest of the war, Ukraine is doing things differently. It hits a refinery, then within days it hits it again. Then again. The idea is to prevent Russia from making the repairs needed to get that refinery online, which is why there are so many shortages today. We dig deeper into this evolved strategy in a video covering what Ukraine is doing, so check out that video to learn more. This combination of high frequency and evolved strike tactics adds up to what we see today: constricted supplies caused by refinery output declining, and we can see the latter issue in the numbers. The Kyiv Post reports that Reuters and the International Energy Agency estimate that Russia's fossil fuel processing output fell from about 4.8 to 5 million barrels per day in July to between 4.5 and 4.7 million barrels per day in August. Again, that may seem like a small change, but it's proven to be more than enough to create shortages throughout Russia. Plus, now Ukraine can see the impact of its strikes, the odds are that it's going to focus more on its new strategy. Refineries Ukraine has already hit in August are going to get hit again, and there appears to be nothing that Russia can do about it. Now let's come back to a term we've used several times in this video: flying sanctions. We don't use that term because it's catchy, but because Ukraine's refinery strikes are literally an attempt by the country to do what the West's sanctions have failed to do. When Putin launched his invasion, the West and Ukraine's other allies, such as Japan, responded by imposing thousands of sanctions. Russia is now dealing with 23,960 sanctions more than it had placed against it before the war started, Castellum reports, which shows that the West at least took the concept of using this potentially powerful form of economic punishment seriously. The problem is that sanctions against Russia's oil products have had problems from the start. One of those problems was a loophole that the European Union has only started to tackle as of July 2025. According to Global Trade Review, Western sanctions generally prohibit the direct purchase of Russian oil, which is all well and good. But what they didn't prohibit was the purchase of oil or oil products from countries that are still buying Russian oil. Turkey and India, for instance, have continued to be major oil customers for Putin throughout the war. Both have been able to sell fuel products to the West, specifically the European Union, with no concern being placed on how these products were made. So Russia could sell crude oil or even refined oil products to one of these countries, using its shadow fleet to transport its product. Then, the country that receives the oil would serve as an intermediary, selling it on to Western nations at a profit. Everybody wins in this situation. Well, almost everybody. Ukraine, which is relying on the West to follow through on its economic measures designed to punish Russia, is the big loser here. We also can't ignore the fact that the EU has continued to buy Russian oil, mostly under contracts that were formed before Putin invaded Ukraine. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air shares the unsettling fact that the EU actually spent more on Russian oil in 2024 than it did on military aid delivered to Ukraine. The disparity was pretty large, $25.5 billion on oil versus $21.8 billion in aid, and the fact that these purchases are happening at all has led Ukraine to ask, what on earth is going on? How can its allies continue funding Russia through oil purchases, knowing that they're doing so to such an extent that they're practically cancelling out the aid being delivered to Ukraine? Ukraine hasn't been shy about letting people know what it thinks about countries that buy Russia's oil. Within weeks of Putin launching his invasion, Ukraine was warning the rest of the world not to buy Russia's oil if they wanted to see the Ukrainian defense succeed. In April 2022, one of Ukraine's top economic advisors, Oleg Ustenko, laid it all bare. People in Europe believe that they can help us, that they're our great friends, and indeed they are, but they do not understand that by supplying this money to Putin, they are funding his military machine. They're using it for killing us, for doing the terrible things they did in Bucha and in other places, Ustenko said. Still, other countries carried on buying Russian oil. Members of the EU were among them, both buying directly and through intermediaries. So Ukraine's flying sanctions and the refinery blasting strategy, of which they're the most important part, are writing the failures of the West's sanctions. After all, if Russia's refineries are being shut down, nobody can buy the oil products it's making. This is a case of, if you won't do it, we will, for Ukraine. And it could be argued that its flying sanctions have achieved more in a month of strikes than Western oil sanctions have achieved in 3.5 years. So what happens next? The New York Post said on September 2nd that the US is now pushing Europe to stop buying Russian oil altogether. It quotes an unnamed senior White House official who says, "The US wants Europe to join in sanctions with Washington and to stop purchasing Russian oil." Ukraine would certainly be happy to see that happen, but there has been no official comment on this supposed push, either from the White House or any European nations. Even if Europe does pull back from its oil purchases, it may be too late. TBS News says that the complex web of sanctions has already failed to stop the Russian energy flow. A combination of time and overuse is blunting the force of US and European financial weapons, the outlet says. It points to a weak price cap on Russian oil and the shadow fleet Putin has created to skirt sanctions as the key reason why the West's approach is delivering diminishing returns. If there's no way back from this issue, then there's only one thing for it: more flying sanctions. Ukraine has proven its version of sanctions work, and it knows that Russia's defenses against its drones aren't strong enough to stop Ukraine's attacks. The fuel shortages are already happening, both inside Russia and Ukraine's occupied territories. No matter what comes next on the Western sanctions front, Ukraine is going to keep pushing with these strikes, and that will mean that the shortages seen today are only the beginning of a situation that is about to get much worse for Russia. To make matters worse for Russia, as Ukraine's flying sanctions wreak havoc on its refineries, Putin's regime is devouring itself from the inside. War has erupted between the FSB and Russia's military generals, and that might just be enough to force Russia itself to come crumbling down. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the latest Ukraine war news. And thank you for watching.